So welcome to the first class of the next block of 6, and today we're going to be looking at drawing skills and observing light, shade and form. And we're going to be working with charcoal. So I have here some medium willow charcoal. And the other thing you'll see me using, and this is an optional item, you really don't need this, this is just Derwent charcoal pencil. And I have these in light, medium and dark. The other thing I have is the Daler Rowney pastel A4 paper. So I'm going to tear a sheet off of here, and I'm going to fix my paper down to the work surface so that it doesn't slip around too much. So I'm just using some masking tape. I just need to mask my corners down like so. This will just stop things slipping around as I work. Okay, so first things first, when we're working with charcoal, it can be quite messy and it's also very fragile to handle. So you'll find it comes in these boxes and it's wrapped up in tissue paper. And we'll just unwrap some. You can buy it in smaller measures like this. This seems to have been accidentally put into my medium pack. This is actually a very small willow stick, but the regular willow charcoal, the mediums, are like this. It looks like a stick of licorice basically. Then when we handle them, firstly we're going to get quite dirty fingers, so something that's quite handy to just keep to one side are some baby wipes, just to keep your hands and your work area clean. And then the other thing to be aware of is it will make dust, particularly if you're using it very heavily. It will come off in sort of powdered residue. Now, whenever you're working with something that's quite powdery, you must make sure that you don't blow that into the work area, because if you breathe that in, it's quite harmful to you. So whenever we're working, we would use something like this, just like a brush that will brush things off of the surface and get it out of our way so that we're not making a mess into the environment. So for my purposes today, I'm going to sketch out just using the pencil, but don't be put off. You can always do this with the willow charcoal, and the thing that you'll notice is it has at the end an area which is sort of like a line. So if you use it this way, you're going to get a thin line. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at the reference photograph, and I'm going to mark where I want the top of my composition to be and some of the other points where I would see things appearing on the page. So this will give us a sense of the kind of scale of things really, and I'm just doing this by eye. There are methods that you can use to help yourself, so you can always, if you wish, use a ruler, and if you want to, if you really don't feel confident, then what you could do is just take a regular pencil. This is just a normal HB pencil, and then you can just measure your paper to make sure that you get half of the width and make a mark in the middle, and half of the length and make a mark in the middle. And then very, very gently and faintly just draw a line which will give you the center point of your composition. And then what this will do, it will give you a line down the middle so that you can work symmetrically, because quite often, depending on how we're wired and depending on excuse me, which hand we tend to use, which hand dominates. So for me, I'm right-handed. We quite often tend to favor the right hand part of the composition. So if I'm doing something this way and I'm drawing a bottle, it seems easy, but the minute I then try to reverse it, it becomes more difficult for my brain, because it's used to kind of working this way rather than this way, if that makes sense. So if you have a symmetry line down the middle and you're confident on building your composition out to the right, then you can just mirror that to the left, and it will just give you a little bit of a kind of a head start really in making your composition land where you want it to land. There's lots of different methods and ways of doing this, but I'm just going to do things very simply today. So the purpose of today's lesson really is to introduce you to charcoal and just to get you drawing and sort of looking at form really. And so I'm going to start, let's see, normally when we work with charcoal we tend to work top down because otherwise we're working over and smudging our composition. So what I want to do is I want to just draw in that very top lip of the bottle, and I'm just doing this by eye, looking at my reference photograph which is in front of me. Now whenever we deal with something which is cylindrical we come across ellipses, and this is kind of the bottom of the ellipse, so we're not really dealing with the ellipse. And when I say ellipse I mean this area here. So when we see the top of something and we see it from different angles, as it tilts, the circle at the top, when it's like this, looks like a circle, and then the more that we tilt something, the more it then becomes lines which aren't completely circular, they're just like showing parts of a circle. I'm sure you'll know what an ellipse is, but just for anyone who may be slightly unsure. So we've kind of dodged that here because we're almost looking up at the bottle, so we don't have to deal with an ellipse. So that's kind of good if this is your first time, because we don't have to worry about that. But what we do need to do is to get an idea of that shape at the top. Now the first rule of drawing really is to start to learn to trust what you're looking at, because quite often we think we're seeing something when actually we're not seeing it at all. It's our brain that's making up information. So we have to remember that because this is taken from a photograph, which as we understand partially distorts our image of it, we then need to make sure that we understand how it really looks, so we're not inventing things and making up information. So again, when you look at this photograph, because the lens of the camera slightly distorts and bends things, whereas in reality this edge of the bottle would be straight, it's actually slightly to an angle, almost like this. And if you have problems drawing straight lines, you can always, if you really want to have a little help, you can always use something which is straight to just guide your hand down. And then also you know that you're coming in because you can see that angle in front of you. You can see that instead of it being straight, it's curving in. So if you need a little bit of assistance, that's just a little tip as you're learning to just build your confidence. And as we come out to the bottom of this bottle, it kind of bows out slightly, and then we're dealing with those circles again. So at the bottom we need to show that curve. Something circular is going to show as a curve in our composition. And this is where, if you're very one hemisphere dominant, the way that you tend to visualize things, this is where you might start to struggle when you're drawing out your composition, because if you're right-handed like me and therefore slightly left brain dominant, then this part seems easy, and then as soon as we come to do this part, we're almost having to mirror and think in reverse. So look at what you've already drawn here and start to think as if you're mirroring what you've already done. So I need to create that bulbous part at the end. Then I can use my straight pencil edge again if I need a little bit of assistance. Now last time the angle was like this, so this time the angle is going to be like this because we're just mirroring what we've already done. So I can turn to my pencil for a little bit of help there, and then I can continue drawing the edge of that bottle. The other place I might want to measure, either with a pencil or with a ruler, is where the shape starts to change. So when I come up to here, that's when I know that the neck of the bottle is going to start coming in. So if I'm working and I'm not too sure whereabouts it is, so this angle starts to come back in here. You can see it just starting to, You can almost reveal it as if it's sort of line by line and then match it if you like, which is what I'm doing here. So you're just working on a small section at a time. Well, you might wish to come down from the top. You might feel more confident that way. So don't forget to look at your source image. We want to keep referring back to the source image and not get too caught up in what's going on our paper. We need to keep looking at what it is that we're trying to replicate. So there we go. That's how we get that outline of the bottle. So I'm going to now switch to working with the willow charcoal, and don't worry if you only had the willow charcoal, and if you weren't confident with drawing, you can always just sketch that out very gently with pencil, just regular HB pencil. And then what you can do is go over that line once you're confident. So the next thing I'm going to want to do is I'm working down my page from the top, and I need to look at the darkest areas. Now I'm not going to worry about the pattern on the bottle. All I'm looking at now is I'm just observing where my darkest areas are. Now that very top part of the bottle here is quite dark, and it's almost like a band of colour. Don't worry about the noise that the charcoal makes, it's quite squeaky on the paper usually. And then we've got another line which is the same as the top one, so we need to draw the same kind of a curve here because it mirrors the shape that we've seen above. And it has like a lip on it as well. And then these parts here are not as dark. So we're thinking in terms of what we call grayscale. So we're thinking of areas which would be almost black, and areas which would be a dark grey, and areas which would be a light grey. And we're also getting a light play on the bottle here. So this was taken in my studio, which does have quite a lot of natural light coming through, and it also has light from all angles. It has light from above and from the sides, so you will get light play on the bottle, and that's purely from the environment that the photograph was taken in. So I'm just blocking in some of these dark areas. Now try and stay inside your line, your external line that you've created, whether that be in charcoal pencil, or whether it's in willow charcoal, or whether it's just in pencil and you're going over it. Now if you're somebody who likes to work in quite a timid way, you might find that the charcoal feels a bit intimidating because it forces you to work very dark, which means it's harder to erase and you need to commit to what it is that you're doing. But don't worry, because we're just practicing and we're learning, so I'm not too worried about the outcome. And we can also change things. We're not stuck with the early stages of something. We can always change things. So we can see there's some light play here, and then there's a big area here of light play, which is quite interesting because it's actually picking up the ceiling of the studio. So we have a very dark area here, which we can draw in. Just mind your hand if you're leaning over something that you've done in charcoal, make sure you're not smudging that down your page. So don't worry about the little dot patterns which are on the bottle itself. Don't need to worry about those at this stage. What we need to do is just make sure that we get the dark areas and we capture those and make sure that they're in the correct places. So again here it almost looks like streaks down the bottle. If you look very closely, you'll almost see lines in this particular area. And then here is actually quite a dark area. And then we also have kind of other shades of grey as well. So we're going to go back up into this area here, and this is actually a sort of slightly paler area. So think about the pressure that you're using. So if we want to work dark, we don't press too hard or we'll break our charcoal. So make sure you don't hold it too far up. But just be quite positive about the way that you apply it to the paper. Now these areas here, I can either, there's two ways to do it. I can either draw them in positively, or I can use subtractive drawing to come back in and do them negatively. Now to do subtractive drawing in charcoal, you need to have putty eraser, which is one of these. Just a simple putty eraser. This is slightly different from a regular pencil eraser. This is a pencil eraser which is made of rubber, and this is a putty eraser which is soft and it's kneadable, which means you can bend it into shape. So it's a different thing altogether. But don't worry if you don't have one. I'll show you the positive way to do this first of all, so that you then know how to do it. So all you're doing is you're just observing what's in the photograph. Now I can see these lines, which are actually panels of the ceiling of the room that I'm in. So I'm just drawing those in where I see them. So there's a kind of greyish smudgy bit here. When we do something which is reflective like this, we use reflective surfaces, it starts to make us really think about light and shade and where we observe things and how we observe things. It gets us to look quite closely. So if we're looking at either a physical reference or if we're looking at a reference photograph, it will actually get us to look quite closely at those things. Now these areas here are not completely white, they're like a very pale grey, so I'm just barely tickling the paper here with the charcoal and leaving some of the white showing through. Don't worry, by the way, if you start to get finger marks here, that's fine. It's because your fingers pick it up, but we can just erase that afterwards, so don't worry. So same thing over here. And what you'll find, if you're using paper with tooth like I am, and by tooth we mean surface texture, then it will start to grip the charcoal. So you'll start to see like the weave of the paper coming through, which is quite nice. Okay, so working down, that was quite a tricky bit. So if you've managed to do that, give yourself a pat on the back. And I'll come back to subtractive drawing later and give you an example. In fact, I might do some subtractive drawing further down the bottle. So don't forget to keep observing whether something is very dark, almost looks black, or whether it's kind of grey. And if it looks grey, then obviously use a lighter pressure on the page. So we're almost building up like a mosaic of different tones. And it's actually training your brain to observe those tones, because when we look at that photograph, we just see a dark bottle. Normally in life, when we look at something and it's dark, we often just say it's black, and quite often black is made up of different pigments anyway. So when we look more closely, we start to see more of the essence of the item rather than the shorthand of the item, which is what our brain perceives items to be. Because of the way that our perception works, it has to actually work by filtering out a lot of the visual information that we come up against. If it didn't do that, we would be completely overwhelmed and bombarded on a daily basis by visual information. So in order to allow the brain to understand things, it uses a shorthand. So that shorthand is kind of the first thing that you see. So for example, let me give you an example of something that's on my studio desk. When I first look at this, which is an ornament that I have, because I love cats, and those who know me will be under no surprises that I have cats around me. When I first look at this, I see a cat ornament. If I touch it, I can feel it's smooth. If I want to draw it, I then have to break down all the different parts of the visual information, the colour, the tones, the patterns. Do you see what I mean? So when I first look at it, it's just shorthand, it's a cat ornament. But if I want to investigate that object, I then have to break down all of the visual information. And that's what happens when we observe something and we want to replicate it. We then have to challenge our brain to sort through all of that visual information into the important things that we need as artists to put that information on paper and make it so that it makes sense to other people and they can understand what something is. So hopefully that makes sense. It's kind of obvious when you say it, but a lot of the reason why people say practice kind of makes perfect with art is because we train our brain to look at things. We train our brain to notice things. We notice the details of things. I'm noticing that this is very squeaky. Right. Now, if I wanted to show you some subtractive drawing here, I probably don't have the correct shaped eraser for this, but I'll go for it. So most of the tone at the bottom of this bottle is black. Okay, it's very dark. So if I sketch that in there and block it out, so we make all of this a dark tone. So there's no shades of grey and there's no light areas there. As I was saying earlier, this is a pencil eraser. It's a Derwent pencil eraser, which I tend not to use the eraser part, but I use the brush quite a bit. But you can use an old paintbrush if you like. It will give you the same result. And this is just to kind of get it so that it comes off of our paper, but without us blowing and making a mess of everything. See if I can move that onto my... What we can do is we can use this to actually create shadow as well. So say we're observing light from a top-down direction, and the shadow would kind of spread in those directions. So I'm not going to worry about that too much. Just get it off my page. So to show you subtractive drawing, if I take a putty eraser, these are always wrapped in plastic, by the way. You take the plastic off, obviously, before you use them. And they go quite hard as well, so you need to keep them somewhere at room temperature, otherwise they can go a bit ropey. So if I want to create this pattern I've got going on this bottle with these dots, I block him, and then, as if by magic, I move my eraser over this and I create these dots, because it removes the charcoal pigment from the paper. There we go. And that's how we get white areas. And now I could have done that method with all of this and with all of this. It's just a different way of working. So we add dark to light and work positively, or we remove dark from light and then we work negatively. So if you hear the term negative drawing or negative space, that's what it's referring to. So I can continue with my little pattern up the bottle if I wish. And these very dark areas where I haven't taken the dust away, it may not look particularly light, but it is. It's just an illusion. So there we go. I can just keep creating that pattern up the bottle. Let's just try this. This is actually a pencil eraser, but sometimes they work. See, that's actually working. Now, the smaller the surface area you have, the easier it is to create the shape you want. So trying to create a delicate circle with something like this is more of a challenge because it's a blunt instrument effectively. Whereas trying to create something detailed with a very small eraser is easier because it's not so cumbersome. So there you go, I can make those more circular. There we go. Just carry on working up here. And I can also add this one if I wish. Just a series of 5 dots. And these dots are actually at an angle, so they're not straight on as we look. They're kind of angled like that. They're not like a square which you see front on. So start to look at angles of things as well. It's all part of honing your observation skill. Now, dealing with these, if I've got loose powder on my page, just brush it off, and then with the putty eraser which actually has some charcoal on it, so it's going to be a little bit more challenging. Create more marks on my piece. I just remove that with this. And also, if I want to shape the shadow area at the bottom, I can use the same trick. It does make my putty eraser very dark, as you can see, which is not ideal. It's transferring bits of green from other things. I love it when a plan comes together. Right. Good thing about erasers is they will take all of the things you don't want off of your page, and if they don't, then you just cover those things up with something else. We don't worry too much. Yeah, but do be careful. If you're using an eraser and it's got very dirty, then it will transfer things back onto your work, so just be a little bit cautious. I'm actually surprised at how well this regular eraser is working to remove the charcoal. So when you look at the reference photograph, you can't really see a shadow, and I've almost created an artificial shadow at the bottom of this. That's kind of a whole other class really, because normally when we see something and it has light from one light source, it will cast a definite shadow. The reason we're not seeing a shadow here is because this was taken in very light conditions and the light's diffused, so it's coming from different directions, so it's not casting a definite shadow. So I can either remove this area at the bottom and just make it so that we have no cast shadow, or I can create a shadow and give an illusion that light's coming from another source. But for now, I'm just going to leave this here, because this has kind of shown you the principles of how to recreate something from a photograph, to think about the angles and the shapes, and to look at the tones.